The year of the pig in the grand, sprawling timeline of history. This year is a blank page, a margin note. Historians look back and see nothing. No great wars that scorched the earth. No plagues that decimated the population. No violent coups that stained the marble steps with fresh blood. On the surface, the great Ming Empire was calm. The sun rose and set over the yellow tiles of the Forbidden City. The rivers flowed. The seasons turned. But this silence was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a stopped heart. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a room where the air has been used up, and the occupants are slowly, unknowingly, asphyxiating. To understand this year, you must forget the image of a golden empire, forget the glory. Instead, picture a vast, stagnant pond. The water is green and thick with algae. It does not move. Beneath the surface, things are rotting, turning into sludge. But the surface remains unbroken, reflecting a gray, indifferent sky. This is the story of the year nothing happened. The year the empire finally, irrevocably, fell asleep, entering a vegetative state from which it would never wake up. At the center of this paralysis sat the Forbidden City. It was not a home. It was a magnificent, painted cage. A tomb constructed for the living. The walls were high, designed to keep the world out, but they did a far better job of keeping the decay in. The air inside these walls was heavy with the smell of old incense and dust, ancient dust that settled on the shoulders of men and the roofs of palaces, a physical weight of tradition that made movement nearly impossible. In the deepest recesses of this labyrinth, hiding in the shadows of the great interior, was the emperor, Wan Li. Wan Li was not a warrior. He was not a tyrant. He was a void. By 1587, he had already begun his long retreat from reality. Imagine a man who possesses absolute power yet refuses to use it. Not out of mercy, but out of a deep, resentful spite. He was like a fat, swollen spider paralyzed in the center of his own intricate web. He did not repair the web. He did not hunt. He simply existed, occupying the space where a ruler should be, absorbing the empire's resources while offering nothing in return but silence. He had stopped attending the morning audiences. He had stopped reading the mountains of reports that piled up on his desk. He refused to fill vacant positions in the government. The bureaucracy, the nervous system of the empire, was screaming for direction, for a decision, for a pulse. But Wan Li gave them nothing. He retreated into the dark, comforting womb of his private quarters, surrounding himself with eunuchs and concubines, letting the machinery of the state rust and seize up. He weaponized his own passivity. His way of fighting the system was to simply cease to function, to become a dead weight so heavy that the entire dynasty began to sink under the burden of dragging him along. Outside the emperor's dark chambers, the machinery of the empire continued to grind on, ghostly and hollow. The Meridian Gate stood tall and imposing, casting long, sharp shadows across the stone courtyard. Every morning, before the sun had even breached the horizon, hundreds of officials would gather there. They were the scholar, bureaucrats, the men who had memorized the classics, the supposed pillars of the nation. But look at them closely. In the gray pre-dawn light, they do not look like leaders. They look like prisoners. They stood in arranged rows, determined by rank, their breath misting in the cold air. They wore their silk robes embroidered with the beasts of their station cranes, pheasants, lions. But the robes were heavy, stiff with starch and sweat. These men were trapped in a ritual that had lost its meaning. They would kneel. They would bow. They would touch their foreheads to the freezing stones, chanting, "Long live the emperor." But the throne was empty. They were performing for a ghost. They were actors in a play where the lead character had walked off the stage years ago. But the supporting cast was forced to continue the scene, over and over again, forever. The dragon seat was just a piece of carved wood. The Son of Heaven was a recluse hiding hundreds of yards away, likely asleep or high on opium. Yet, the ritual demanded they bow, so they bowed. They bowed to the emptiness. They bowed to the stagnation. This daily theater was a cage of invisible bars, the etiquette, the protocol, the moral codes. They were meant to maintain order, but now, they were just chains. The officials were terrified of making a mistake, terrified of stepping out of line, so they did nothing. They wrote poems. They debated the proper size of a funeral tassel. They argued over ancient texts. They did everything except govern. It is a terrifying thing to witness a government that has turned inward, obsessed with its own internal logic while the real world crumbles. The stagnation was comfortable. It was safe. To change anything was to risk disaster. So, the empire chose the slow death of the familiar over the sharp pain of the new. There were, of course, ghosts of what could have been. The shadow of the great reformer, the Grand Secretary who had died 5 years prior, still loomed over the court. But his legacy was being dismantled, brick by brick. Wan Li, in his passive aggression, allowed the vultures to pick the corpse of the reform. Everything went back to the way it was, inefficient, corrupt, comfortable. And then there was High Ray. High Ray. The name should have sounded like a beacon, a light in the fog. But in 1587, High Ray was not a light. He was an irritation. He was a moral relic, a fossil from a time when integrity meant something. He was an old man now, appointed to a position in the South, far from the capital. High Ray believed in the absolute purity of the law. He believed in starving himself to feed the poor. He believed that if everyone just followed the rules of the ancients, the world would be saved. But High Ray was a tragic figure. He was a square peg in a round world. He was a living statue, cold and unyielding. When he tried to enforce the law, he didn't fix the corruption. He just stopped the flow of life. He was so rigid, so obsessed with moral perfection, that he became a symbol of the empire's inability to adapt. He walked through the bureaucracy like a specter, haunting the corrupt officials, making them feel a moment of shame, but changing nothing. The tragedy of High Ray was that he was right, technically, but he was right in a way that didn't matter anymore. He was shouting into a void. The system was not broken because of a lack of morals. It was broken because it was designed to be static in a dynamic world. High Ray wanted to freeze time. He wanted to return to a golden age that never existed. He, too, was a symptom of the disease, the belief that looking backward was the only way to move forward. He was a lonely, bitter old man, clutching his books of law while the water in the pond turned putrid around his waist. In this year, 1587, the empire was like a grand old house where the owners have stopped doing maintenance. The roof wasn't leaking yet, not badly. The walls weren't collapsing, not visibly. But the termites were in the wood. The damp was in the foundation. The yin, the dark, passive, feminine principle had completely swallowed the yang, the active, bright, masculine principle. There was no fire left, only ash. The interactions between the emperor and his ministers became a bizarre form of trench warfare. The ministers would send up a memorandum begging Wan Li to name an heir, to attend a ceremony, to do something. Wan Li would respond with the most powerful weapon he had, silence. He simply kept the papers. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He just absorbed them into the void. The retention of the middle. It was a black hole strategy. The bureaucrats were fighting a war against a man who refused to fight back, who simply absorbed their blows and let them exhaust themselves. This created a profound sense of melancholy. A deep gray depression settled over the capital. Talented men grew old, waiting for appointments that never came. Ideally, they wanted to serve the state, to build, to conquer, to improve. Instead, they spent their lives arguing over the proper pronunciation of a word in a text written 2,000 years ago. They channeled their energy into meaningless disputes, into factional fighting that was vicious precisely because the stakes were so low. It was the politics of the lifeboat, fighting over who gets to sit where, while the ship slowly drifts towards the horizon, engines dead. Imagine the nights in the Forbidden City during this year. The wind howling through the vast, empty courtyards, the sound of dry leaves skittering across the stone, the thousands of eunuchs and maids moving silently like shadows, serving a master who was barely there. It was a city of whispers, a city of secrets that weren't worth keeping. There was no joy. Even the festivals felt forced, a pantomime of celebration performed by people who had forgotten what they were celebrating. The tragedy of 1587 is not that it was a year of disaster. It is that it was a year of missed opportunities. It was the point of no return. The empire had cancer, but it looked healthy enough on the outside. It could walk, it could talk, but the cells were mutating. The vitality was gone. The ability to heal itself was gone. Wan Li would sit in his palace for another 30 years. 30 years of this, 30 years of holding his breath, 30 years of letting the spider web gather dust. By the time he died, the Ming Dynasty was not dead, but it was hollowed out. It was a dried husk, waiting for the strong wind of the Manchus to blow it over. But the death didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened here, in the quiet. It happened in the boredom. It happened in the ink that dried on unread petitions. This is the horror of the year. Nothing happened. It teaches us that the end of the world doesn't always come with a bang. It doesn't come with fire and brimstone. Sometimes the end comes with a yawn. It comes with a shrug. It comes with a man sitting on a throne, staring at a wall, deciding that today he will do absolutely nothing. And then doing it again the next day. And the next. The air in 1587 is still there, trapped in the history books. If you breathe it in, it tastes stale. It tastes of old paper and rotting lotus flowers. It is the taste of an empire that has forgotten how to live, yet refuses to die. It is the suffocation of stability, the perfect, orderly, harmonious silence of the grave. The year is over. Nothing happened. And that is the saddest story of all.